Philippians chapter 2 is where we'll be from. Sorry about being late. I was talking to somebody in the hall, and we were just talking and just going on.
Okay.
Somebody walked by and said, "Aren't you supposed to teach class?" And I thought, oh my goodness. All right, so here we are. Have you?
We've all been busy.
Okay, good. Yeah, good. So we're in good shape there. As far as things going on, as Doug said, it's a busy few weeks we got going. Next week is when the Freed Hardeman Chorus comes through. And hopefully you remember the times we've done that before. We didn't do it last year, but in the 6 years I've been here, this will be their fourth time to come. And so we've had them pretty often. And if you'd like to sign up for them to stay with you, feel absolutely free to let us know, and that'll be a good thing. What your responsibilities are if they stay with you, all right? You got to pick them up Saturday night, but we're going to feed them before they go to your house. And then you got to bring them to church Sunday, right? And then we'll have breakfast up here waiting on them about 8:30. So you don't have to worry about feeding them one way or the other unless you just want to. They're college kids, and college kids never turn down food. But just give them a place to stay, whether it be a couch, a bed, or whatever else it may be, and that'll be all you have to do. Now, why is it fun to keep them? Because it's really interesting getting to meet every one of them. They're all from different places, primarily around the South. They're good kids, and it's an opportunity. That's the reason the chorus travels, is it's a way for the school to advertise itself and a way for you to get to know truly what Freed Hardeman people are like. And so if you end up keeping them, you'll really enjoy it. It'll be a good thing. I think you'll like it quite a bit. As far as other things going on, remember, not next week, but the next week is when Nathan will be moving in, and he is a scheduler. He was explaining to me the other day, he is going to get up Saturday. They're going to have everything packed. Remember, he's got a newborn that's, a month and a half old, and then he's got two small kids. They're going to pack, bring everything up here, right? Unload from 11 to 1, drive back the 2.5 hours that it takes to drive back. I think it's 3 hours to drive back. He's supposed to preach a wedding at 6, and then he's supposed to preach the next morning at Boonville, and then they're going to travel with the rest of their stuff up here, and he says they're going to be here for worship with us at 4 that Sunday afternoon. So we'll see how that goes. I told him, you hit 2 out of 4, that'll be good. But we'll see. But he's got that going on. So if you can help and assist in that sort of stuff, probably don't want to do the wedding, but in any of the other stuff, if you can help, that'll be a good thing. Anything else we got going on? You need to bring up? This will be announced probably in the bulletin next week. But we gave just south, I think, of $10,000 for a hurricane relief effort. That money went directly to a church in Katy, Texas, which is just northeast of Houston, not very far outside of it. And they called me last week. They have sent that money to a place called Lakeshore. Tyler Young's the preacher there. They've sent some of the money to a place called Richmond, and they've sent some money to a place in inner city Houston. Each one, Churches of Christ, and they are helping their members and also kind of housing people who are working on houses in those areas. But they had told me when we sent them the money that they would send financial reports and everything like that. As they'd spent it, I think they have several $1 million in all that have been given to them from different Churches of Christ. So it's going to take a while to distribute everything and get all the financials straight. But I wanted to give at least a preliminary report of where that's gone, because sometimes, you give money and then you forget, or you just kind of wonder, I wonder whatever happened with that. So that's that sort of thing. All right? And I'm glad I saw Scott fix the clock a second ago. I was preaching a sermon. I was on point number 3, and I thought, I may be running out of time. So I looked up at the clock, and it said 4:15. And I thought, I got 6 hours. I don't have to hurry at all today. Got plenty of time. This is usually when you have a comment.
You thought again, didn't you?
Yeah, I thought again. That's right. All right. All right, we are back in Philippians chapter 2. And we have just finished, remember last week we talked about that drink offering, right? In verse 17. What I want to spend some time on is Timothy. And we're introduced to him here in this passage in verses 19 through 24. So let's read it. Philippians 2, beginning in verse 19. But I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly, that I also may be encouraged when I know your state. For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state. For all seek their own, not the things which are of Jesus Christ. But you know his proven character, that as a son with his father, he served with me in the gospel. Therefore I hope to send him at once, as soon as I see how it goes with me. But I trust in the Lord that I myself may also come shortly. All right, when you think about Timothy, what are some of the things that come to mind? What are some of the things that come to mind when you think about Timothy?
He was young.
Okay, you got a young preacher. Right. What else? Okay, 2 Timothy 1:5. He is influenced by his mother and his grandmother, whose names are what? Lois and Eunice. All right, excellent. Now, why did they play such a big part in his life? Remember Acts 16? Right, they taught him the scriptures. Let's go ahead and look at Acts 16. Let's look at some background of this fella here. Now here, there's some supposition and such, but I don't think we're going too far. He is here in Lystra, which is an area more or less right there just between Asia and Europe. Okay? And as you look at Acts 16, verse 1, you see where he enters into the city, and he runs across a young man named Timothy. This is where Paul is introduced to this young man. Now, what's interesting is his mother is a believer, and obviously his grandmother is going to be a believer, right? Lois and Eunice. But what's the deal with his daddy? It was a Greek, all right? A barbarian or a Greek. He was not a Jew. And so we see a little bit of an interesting situation here. Now, in reading of that and seeing 2 Timothy 1:5, it looked like he was in a religiously split home. His father does not appear to be a believer. He's obviously not of a Jewish heritage, but his father does not appear to be a believer, and so his father doesn't seem to have a spiritual background. Now, 4 times, Timothy is referred to as Paul's son. Paul oftentimes would refer to himself as a father of those whom he spiritually taught, but it looks like it goes a little bit deeper, especially here in Philippians 2 and also in 1 Timothy. What it looks like is Paul developed a very strong mentoring relationship with Timothy. And Timothy turned out to be one of those guys who were the special shock troops, if you will, of Paul. It's where Timothy was the guy he sent to accomplish big things. When things were going south somewhere, oftentimes Paul would send Timothy to be able to settle the situation which was going on. All right? So where did Timothy end up preaching, as far as we know, in 1st and 2nd Timothy? It's a church or a city which is prominent throughout the New Testament. Church in Ephesus, okay? And so, of course, you see where Ephesus, Paul visits there. You see where 1st and 2nd Timothy are written to the city of Ephesus. You see where you have the Ephesian church. You see where you go to Revelation 2 and you see Ephesus has fallen on hard times. Even though they have a great reputation, they're kind of cold in their works, and they're not really into it as much as they should be. But Timothy was a preacher there as well, okay? Now, let's see, what else we want to talk about Timothy as we look at the background which is there. Timothy was a fella who, it looks like in 2 Timothy, was a little bit on the burned out side. Read 2 Timothy sometime and look at the emotions which are being mentioned. It looks like Timothy is just having problems. And sometimes preachers can get burned out. Sometimes it's possible for preachers to become discouraged in their work. Now, why was it important for Paul to send Timothy? What are some of the characteristics here in Philippians 2 that Paul says about Timothy? His character, right. Timothy had a trait which Paul says very few people have. And how was it that he treated other people, according to Philippians 2? What's his character trait, he says? I have no one like him who does what? Who genuinely cares for other people more than he does himself. One thing you see about Timothy, and I think is very, very interesting, he was a guy who really cared about other people. And you see it as much as you don't really ever see a sermon necessarily that he wrote, but you see just his attitude in caring for other people. Now, it's been said people don't care as much as what you say, but they care more about what? How you treat them, how you are. And that can be true, especially for a lot of preachers. You have a lot of preachers who are super, super eloquent, but sometimes they do damage to the cause of Christ because their heart's not in the right place. It's all about them. It's all about themselves meeting their own needs rather than themselves giving themselves to other people. Yes, sir.
Also, Paul had him circumcised
Yes.
so he could communicate with Jews without offending.
Right.
So that means that his mother probably wanted him to be circumcised, but his father wouldn't.
Hadn't allowed it. That's right.
And so it was. So he had to change some things. In other words, it was not a perfect household, and yet he rose above it.
Right. There's two aspects there. Of course, you look at some of the other preachers, Silas, who was with Paul. Paul never demanded that Silas be circumcised, although he was a Gentile full and through, so that issue wasn't there. Paul had Timothy circumcised, okay? Part of that was because mixed household, partial Jewish side there, it was a way of just removing that argument totally, okay? That's usually how we look at it. Now, let's go a little bit deeper, all right? You ever have somebody ask you to do something inconvenient in church? You know, man, can you host kids, right? Can you bring chili, right? Can you move here, move there? Every once in a while, like, oh, you know, they're asking different stuff, all right? Look what Timothy got asked to do in church one day. Pretty big deal, right? Pretty big deal. And not to make light of circumcision. But here you see a man who is willing to go through a great deal of pain and discomfort for the sake of the cause of Christ. And what you see there is a little bit of Timothy's mindset, willing to go through that in order to remove the argument. I might say myself, I would rather just have the argument, right? But you see here that attitude. Now, looking at Timothy's character and who he is, now take a step back. Once again, let's look at the context of the book. And we've covered the context of the book each week because I think every verse fits together to show us the mindset of what's going on. Philippi was a church without problems. There's no doctrine necessarily that's being spoken here. Nothing about instrumental music, nothing about leadership in a church, nothing about ungodliness, right? But there is an underlying problem in the church. And as you go through, you see it most clearly in chapter 4, verse 2. You got at least two ladies who are butting heads and not getting along together at all. And as you begin reading in the book and start reading between the lines, you see a church which is doctrinally right, but you also see a church where there seems to be some petty arguments going back and forth, some things which are happening here and there. And so you see in chapter 1, Paul makes mention to him, I'm in prison. And there's people who are speaking ill of me, things which are going on, and I might die. But in verse 121, for me, I'm going to live for Christ. And if I die, that's gain. But as long as I'm in this body, he says, I'm preaching Christ. What's Paul teaching these people? Set aside these petty arguments and put first the gospel of Christ. Now look at chapter 2. In chapter 2, you get the 4 examples of how chapter 1 works. Okay? The idea of setting aside petty issues in order to put God first. Example number 1, which is case closed, Philippians 2, 5 through 11. Let your mind be like whom? Chapter 2, verse 5. Christ. Let your attitude be the same as that of Jesus Christ. Or have ye the mind of Christ? He was in heaven. He saw a need that I have, that you have, and he gave himself up and took on the very nature of man, took on the very nature of a servant, was treated as a criminal so that he could serve us. What's the lesson Paul's teaching here? Lesson of humility and service in the church. Now, 9 through 11, when he did this, God raised him up and gave him the name that is there above every name. When we serve, Paul is saying, God will bless you. Now, looking at what we looked at last week, Paul says, even I myself, I am being poured out as a drink offering. What's he saying? When somebody is bothering you and you're upset and you say, this is too inconvenient for me, Paul says, I want you to think about me and what it is I'm going through. My whole life is poured out before God, is being used in God's service. That puts a different mindset, which is here. Example number 3 is going to be Timothy. Here's Timothy. And believe me, these people in Philippi knew who Timothy was. Lystra is not far away. And being a preacher in the church, these guys knew Timothy. They probably knew Timothy's family pretty well. And so you run here and you see Timothy, a man who had been circumcised, a man who is used so much by Paul. And Paul says, I want you to see this man as he comes, and I want you to recognize his character. And what's his character? That he puts the needs of what? Others above himself. And example number 4, which we'll look at in a little bit later, Epaphroditus. And what was it Epaphroditus did? Epaphroditus had brought the gift from the Philippians to Paul while he was in prison. And his job was to be there and to serve Paul and take care of Paul. And what Paul's going to say is, I want you to see your own person that you sent who became very sick in Rome and almost died. And I want you to recognize the sacrifice that he's made. You see how those 4 things work together? Okay? Now, what are all 4 of those lessons teaching? Look in chapter 2 and verse 3. What's he saying in chapter 2 and verse 3? Let nothing be done through selfish conceit, but what?
But in lawlessness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself.
Okay, let nothing be done through selfish conceit, but in your humility and lowliness of mind, let you look to others rather than yourself. You see that lesson which is coming through. Okay? Now, bring that to Marshall County. Bring that to the Benton Church. What does that look like? You ever see issues arise between people in the church? If you're in the church very long, you do, right? Okay, the only place that there's not problems between people is cemetery, right? It's the only place which there's not problems among people is when people are either spiritually dead or physically dead. And sometimes in a physical death, issues can come. I remember, I guess it was 10 years ago, we had done a funeral for a man, and it was with this funeral home that messed up everything. I used to tell people, don't go to this funeral home. But anyway, somebody went to the funeral home. Well, we did the funeral, and everything went fine. They called me about 3 weeks later. I guess it was a month and a half later. They called me, and they said, we need you to come back out here. And I was like, all right. So I came back out there, and they said, we made a mistake. Believe me, imagine that, right? And they had buried the guy in the wrong plot. And they said, the law says we have to let their family watch while we dig him up and move him over here. And we don't know what everything's going to be like. And besides, since the family's here, we'd like you to come and say a few words, right? So what do you preach? What do you talk about when you have a few words on that one? Any suggestions? What would you talk about?
Resurrection.
That's what I did. I said, this man has risen, but not for real. Next time is going to be more real, right? And nobody giggled about that except me, but I had a good time with that sermon. All right. Anyway, I said, this is not the real resurrection. He is rising, but not for the real, next time it's going to be a lot more exciting. Well, we moved the grave over and everything else. It's the only time I've seen problems in the cemetery. When you have real life people, and these people are each going through a struggle of the church and of Jesus and the Spirit working through them, you're going to have issues. And a church, a healthy church, is not a church that doesn't have problems. If you're in a church that has no problems, you're in a church that's not alive. A healthy church is a church that deals with problems in the correct way, with love, with humility, and with submission to God. With the problems in church? Oh, with the thing? They did fine. You know, I knew them pretty well, and they really weren't as mad as I think I would have been. I think I would have been a lot angrier. But they weren't that upset, and it was a very simple process because he was just 2 plots over, and so they brought him up. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they all lived local. His name was Noon Weathers, and he had been an older man, and he had been sick for a long time. And so while there was grief, there wasn't as much grief necessarily as it would have been, you know, somebody who had been in the height of their health and such and had that happen. But yeah, the family did pretty well with it. And in fact, they kind of giggled about the whole thing. So I guess it wasn't as bad as it could have been, and as it sounds probably when I recount it and such. But it was one of those really old cemeteries. There were more people in that cemetery than lived in the town, which is a big deal because thousands upon thousands of people live in that town. So it's one of those old cemeteries in the middle of a big town there. But I think about that every time, you know, go back.
How did they discover their fault?
They were burying a guy there. And that's the reason we kind of had a hustle, is they were going to bury the guy that afternoon, and they had dug the grave 2 days before, and they found a casket in it, and they thought, we may have a problem, you know. And so they went back to their records to try to figure out who had been buried there. Yeah, all right. Funeral people, they're fun. All right. What was I talking about? Oh, putting the needs of other people in front of them. I've had a lot of people say, man, you need to write stories about preaching and all these things that happen, you know, when it goes through. But I think other preachers probably have better stories. But every once in a while, you'll find some good stories that preachers have of how things happen one way or the other. And so I did a wedding at Walnut Grove yesterday, and they have a problem at Walnut Grove. They have a wasp nest somewhere above the tiles, and they haven't found out exactly where it's at. And so sometimes if you sing a lively song, and I said, does this make you Pentecostal? And they're like, no, it doesn't make us Pentecostal. But I thought that was funny. You know, you got to be careful sometimes. You can't get too live in there, or you have some problems that goes on. So that's what I did that whole wedding. I was watching to see. All right. Oh, we should not have this much fun in class. It's just not allowed. All right, so as we look at Timothy, what I want us to see, especially today, is a guy who gives his life in service to God. And it goes beyond just the basics that we talk about. Man, this guy was circumcised to help the church. Here's a guy who came from a broken home, and because of the example of his mother and grandmother, he ended up being, you know, maybe a star in the church. I mean, he was a guy who was well known as a preacher and well known in his work. But what really made Timothy special, and that Paul brings up here, is the aspect that he cared for other people more than he cared for himself. Remember that aspect whenever you're in the church and you see issues arise. When somebody wrongs you, when somebody offends you, when something happens, think about that aspect. Here's Timothy, and he cared about other people more than he cared about himself. Now, this does not talk about false teaching. Timothy was never open to false teaching or allowed that to pass. But it cares about the issues of life that you go through. Anytime you have live people together, you're going to have problems. Something will pop up when that goes on. Right? Okay, any comment?
Paul kind of had that attitude too. He was sending him, I think he'd really liked Timothy to been with him.
Right. Yeah, you needed friends in prison.
Yeah.
And, you know, Paul was surrendering a lot by sending Epaphroditus back, by saying, I'm going to send you Timothy, and I'm hoping that I get out. You know, when you're in that prison, you want to be around people. So that's true. That's a very good point. Paul was showing that aspect as well. Okay. Any other things? All right. Let's get started on Epaphroditus. Just a little bit. And Epaphroditus is somebody we could talk about for a good while. Look at verse 25. Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier. See the three adjectives there? But your messenger, the one who ministered to my need. And since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard he was sick. For indeed he was sick, almost even to death. And God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I send him the more eagerly, that when you see him again you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem. Because of the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what is lacking in your service towards me. All right. Now, Epaphroditus appears to have been a young man. He was the one chosen to transport the financial gift that the church had sent to Paul. We see in chapter 1 and chapter 4 that the church had gathered some money and sent it to Paul to support him in prison. Prison back in those days was a very difficult situation. You didn't eat unless somebody came and brought you food, or unless they brought you money to be able to support yourself. You didn't have things unless people were able to give you money to support those things which you're able to do. And so if you're in prison and you wanted to have any sort of ministry or work, you needed support from other people. Now, we think of that usually as hoping somebody will bring me food, right? But it went deeper than that. What did Paul oftentimes do when he was in prison? Yeah, he wrote. Most of our books in the New Testament are books written by Paul when he was in prison, right? Okay. Sometimes we don't have that first century world in our mind necessarily. When I want to write a letter, okay, how difficult is it for me to do? I got to go to Walmart, got to get the little note cards, right? And you want the ones with the big picture and the big writing so you don't have to write very much, right? Not really. Or you go and get notebook paper and you get a pen and you just start writing away, okay? All right, did they have Walmart in the first century? No, right? Okay. Did they have the big pens and the paper in the first century? What were these things written on? Scrolls, papyrus, vellum, things such as that. All right. How do you make papyrus?
You weave it, you beat it, you put glue on it, you do whatever.
It was like a reed, that you have out here at the lake or whatever. It was a special thing which came out of Egypt. You would spread it out and you'd have to dry, right? And then you'd put a glue on top of it, and then you'd get some others, and you'd lay it this way, lay it this way, lay it this way, lay it this way. All right, here's the point since the bell rang, okay? Here's the point. It's been estimated the book of Romans, the materials that went into the book of Romans would be somewhere between $800 and $1,600 for Paul to write, okay? It was not just, hey, I'm just going to write something and ship it right off. The materials that went into that took a lot of financial means. That's why each one of these books are not just throwaway books. They're very serious for us to have and notice. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week, Lord willing. Thank you for being here. See you tonight.
Where'd they get the glue? Where'd they get the glue?
I think